Local history. Local culture. Local events. Your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Our guest is Frank Tomaino. Whenever we have Frank in, we talk about local history, and that's what we're going to do about today. But before we do that, we're going to say welcome, Frank. Good to see you again, as always.
Great to be here.
Frank, before we get into some local history, I'm just curious about something. You've been writing your column for the Observer-Dispatch for a lot of years on history. How many years is it?
1968.
On the history?
Well, it was called Frankly Speaking. I would say 90% were in the word history.
Okay.
This Week in History, started in 1985, I believe, or 86, yeah.
Well, the first column, Frankly Speaking, do you remember what the first column was?
Sure do.
What was it?
I was reading the biography of Grover Cleveland, and all of a sudden I'm reading where his family moved to Holland Patton. I said, what is this? I was never taught this. So I started doing some research, and lo and behold, that not only did his parents and his family lived in Holland Patton, but the mother and father were buried there. So I drove up to Holland Patton, and I went to the cemetery. They only have one cemetery. A guy was mowing the lawn. I said, where's the grave sites of the parents of President Grover Cleveland? He told me where it was, way in the back, nice big monument. And it said, Richard and Ann Cleveland, parents of so on and so forth. And so I started doing a little research, and my column was about going to the cemetery and find, but then, and what a reaction I got. There was no email in those days, but I got phone calls, and the fact that Cleveland would spend a lot of time in Utica, stop in Utica on his way to Holland Patton. For a short time, he went to school in Clinton, where his classmate was Clara Barton.
Wow.
I mean, one of the great things about, and I don't have to tell you this, doing research, you start stumbling on all this stuff. It's so interesting. I find it so interesting.
One thing leads to another.
Yeah. And Cleveland, in fact, at the village of Clinton's 100th anniversary, which I believe was that time it would be 1880 something. President Cleveland and his wife, who was the Jackie Kennedy of her day, visited Clinton, and he spent some time there. You know.
Now, Grover Cleveland's sister,
Rose Cleveland.
She's a story unto herself.
Right. When Cleveland became president, 1885, he was a bachelor. They needed a first lady. So he suggested his sister, Rose, who lived in Holland Patton, well-educated, author, wrote 2 or 3 books, very educated woman. And he asked her to be the first lady. She accepted. This did not make the media very happy. They said, how could a farm girl from Holland Patton be the first lady? You know, she's going to have to plan banquets and all. But Cleveland knew better, and the Washington Post even had an editorial suggesting that the wife of the vice president plan all the White House. Well, the first banquet they had, where they invited ambassadors from other countries and Supreme Court justices, and it was a big affair. And Rose Cleveland was in charge, and everybody was. And of course, it went fine. Not only that, she could speak German, English, French, Italian. She impressed everyone. But then after 2 years, Cleveland got married, and Rose Cleveland returned to Holland Patton. And then later, when World War I started, now I guess she was probably in her 60s or 70s, she went to Italy to help. She wasn't a nurse, to do whatever she could do to help. And
With the Red Cross, wasn't it?
well, I don't think it was it could have been the Red Cross, I'm not sure. But anyway, she caught the flu there and died. Mm-hmm. That's where she's buried. Mm-hmm. And in the monument in the cemetery at Holland Patton, the monument to his father, who was a Presbyterian minister, by the way, it mentions that Rose Cleveland is in Lucca, Italy, buried in Lucca, Italy. So that was the first column. You don't forget the first column, you know.
Yeah. Lisa got a good reaction.
I did.
Yeah.
I guess a lot of people didn't know that.
Yeah. And did that set the tone, Frank, in terms of you writing so many columns about history?
Well, I was always interested in history. I'd say I mentioned many times, my mother and father loved history, always talking history, scrapbooks with history. So, and it was easy, and I always, I think my next 2 or 3, I know my next one was about that Oneida County should be really proud of some of the men and women who, and I mentioned Roscoe Conklin, Horatio Seymour. You'd be surprised how many people, according to the letters I got and the phone calls, did not know that Seymour ran for president at one time. Mm-hmm. They knew the names, Conklin Park, Seymour, they knew the names, but there wasn't that much publicity about all this stuff. You know?
One of the things that I'm jealous of with you, Frank, is that you, if I remember correctly, thanks to your mother, have everything you've ever written, correct?
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing when you think about it?
Yeah, and of course the scrapbooks, I have some of my sister. My mother kept, she just loved to keep scrapbooks. And where that helped me, as I was writing my column, even when I became city editor, it helped me when, like for instance, if I'm writing, when they tore down City Hall on Genesee Street, naturally, every day there was a picture in the paper, Danny Tranquilli, Leo Habaika, they would take pictures. My mother cut them out, and she'd date them, which is important. So I could look, and I look, 1963, the City Hall's starting to come down. And
yeah, I hope someday that maybe the History Center will get all those scrapbooks. What a resource.
If they would want them, but I think the History Center does get scrapbooks but I go through some of them, but a lot of them, there's no dates.
Yeah, dates are, you're right, dates are important. Yeah. Frank Tomaino is our guest. We're talking local history. Frank continues to write his column for the Observer-Dispatch and work in all sorts of areas on local history. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Frank Tomaino is our guest. We're talking local history. Frank, before I go on talking about local history, I want to just mention her name, Shara Pula, who just passed away.
Yes.
And she did a lot for local history.
Great historian, researcher.
Yeah.
Interesting lectures.
Yeah.
Great person.
Yeah. The community lost, she passed a couple weeks ago.
Right, yeah.
And the community really lost somebody
who
cared deeply about it. Speaking of somebody who cares deeply about history, we're in the area of 4th of July. How was this area celebrating 4th of July back in the day? I mean, was it...
Like we do today, parades, fireworks, always a concert at the Parkway. So basically, like I say, celebrated as we do today. I wrote a column recently that I believe it was 1892. The city decided to do something different, so it was unique enough. So it was a big story. The paper, the city said, no fireworks, no concert, nothing. You got a day off from work, relax. And which angered a lot of people. They want to see fireworks. And the Utica Observer editorialized that the city made a mistake, that the 4th of July should be noisy with fireworks. And so, but normally it was just the way we celebrate today.
Did they come back the next year?
Yes, they did, yeah.
Well, there is that, my mind just went blank, but one of the founding fathers who said that 4th of July should be celebrated with fireworks.
Yeah.
And
John Adams made a mistake, though. He thought it would be July 3rd. Because on July 3rd, they first did the paperwork, and then they, of course, everyone didn't sign July 4th. The New York delegates signed in August, which included a man who lived, died, and is buried in Oneida County.
And that is?
William Floyd. William Floyd moved from Long Island to the town of Western in 1784, bought a lot of land, built a home, and he lived there until he was 87 when he died in the early 19th century. But he was one of the 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence, 4 from New York. He was one of the 4 from New York. And talking about doing research and stumbling on something else, because I've written as you have, many columns about William Floyd. One time I stumbled the fact that William Floyd's son-in-law was Abraham Varick, the founder of Varick. Varick Street is named after him.
Right.
He owned land where Varick Street is now, and he married William Floyd's daughter, Anne. So, so we do have a connection. Floyd is, we don't realize that. We celebrate the 4th, the fireworks, but I wonder how many people really, what those 56 men did, they were really risking their lives. If the British had won the war, and if there was a Las Vegas in 1776, the odds would have been 100 to 1 that the Americans would win. The British were a superpower, the biggest navy in the world. The Americans were a bunch of farm boys, didn't even know how to march or so for these 6 men, and they were not wealthy, but 25 were lawyers. Most of them were, had money, and they knew if the British won, the first thing they'd be hanged, and there'd be no doubt about it, as traitors, because they were British, and but they gave, in fact, one of them, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland. He was the richest, a multimillionaire. He was the only Roman Catholic to sign, and he was the last one to die. He was 95 in 1832. And so we should be proud of the fact that a William Floyd, one of those signers, is our neighbor here in Oneida County.
You mentioned, Frank, we had an army that was barely an army. They couldn't march. They didn't have discipline, on and on. But 2 people that come to my mind from reading history that turned that around were Baron Steuben and General Lafayette. I want to save Lafayette for our next segment.
Yeah.
But General Steuben.
No doubt about it. He was the drill master of the Revolutionary War. When he went to Valley Forge and met George Washington, the men didn't know how to march. They didn't even know what to do with a bayonet. I mean, they knew how to shoot a rifle. They were farm boys, but they just didn't know how to fight in battle. Baron von Steuben was a veteran of Frederick the Great's army in Austria, and he volunteered to help the Americans, no salary. He became a major general, and during the winter of Valley Forge, the bad winter of Valley Forge, he turned, well, there were about 6,000, he turned that army around by drilling. What he did, he got 100, like their sergeants, drilled them, and then they drilled the other men in the cold winter, and taught them quite a bit. And George Washington, I've written about this many times. When the war ended, the Americans won, and it was Christmas Eve, and George Washington was resigning as commander-in-chief and going back to Mount Vernon. And he wrote, the last letter he wrote was to Baron von Steuben, and he used the word, "You were indispensable. Without you, we would have lost the war." He only said that about one other, Ben Franklin. He could have said it about Lafayette too, because Lafayette was instrumental in getting France, like Franklin, to help us during the war. We would have won the war without France. But the fact that he calls Baron von Steuben indispensable, because Valley Forge, when spring came, well, those American soldiers marched out and surprised the British. They had been used to fighting these farm boys who, go behind a tree and shoot instead of marching.
And Baron Steuben is buried in Oneida County.
Yeah, he's buried just in Remsen, just west of Remsen, a beautiful memorial park there, the Sacred Grove. He's buried there, and there's a replica of a cabin when he.
And he wanted to not any fanfare, not any celebration or anything. He wanted it all plain and simple. Yes.
Yeah. Well, in fact, when he died, he wanted an unmarked grave. But then I guess what happened years later, they were building a road through there, and they would have to go, where he was buried. So they figured once they disinterred the body, and then a group got together. Franklin Roosevelt, when he was governor of New York, was very instrumental in making that a memorial park. He said, Steuben is quite a guy. And in fact, I think while he was still governor, one of his last acts, he came to Remsen and dedicated the Steuben Park. Yeah.
When we come back, we'll talk about Lafayette. Some things are upcoming, a celebration next year about Lafayette. We'll talk a little bit about that celebration and what it's all about. Frank Tomaino's our guest. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Frank Tomaino's our guest. Frank is our go-to guy when we talk local history. He continues to write his column for the Observer-Dispatch about local history. We were talking, Frank, before the break about another indispensable person, and that was General Lafayette. And he talk a little bit about his contribution in the war.
He was only a very wealthy Frenchman. He was only 19 years old, where Mike Steuben had heard about the American Revolution and decided to help the Americans at no salary. George Washington took a liking to him, called him his son, and he was smart militarily, and before you know it, he was a major general and fighting in battles.
Yeah.
He was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine.
Didn't Washington bring in his own personal physician?
Well, who's another Oneida County, goes on and on. At the Battle of Brandywine, Lafayette was shot in the leg, but they couldn't stop the bleeding. Washington's personal physician was Dr. John Cochran, who Washington sent to Brandywine and said, treat him as if he were my son. Cochran was able to stop the bleeding, and he saved Lafayette's life. In Lafayette's autobiography that he wrote years later, he said his life was saved by good Madeira wine and and the talent of John Cochran. John Cochran is now buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Utica. One more thing about Lafayette, there's a couple of connections. Not only Dr. Cochran, but Lafayette was in charge of a division in the Battle of Yorktown, the last battle in 1781, where the British finally, Washington defeated Cornwallis. Time for us to give up. And a resident of what is now Oneida County actually disobeyed an order, but by doing it, saved Lafayette's life. During the battle, American troops were moving. Lafayette gave an order. He wanted this other unit not to fire, put their guns down until all the American troops passed. They did. Well, this one American soldier saw a British sniper. He had Lafayette and is aiming at Lafayette, ready to pull the trigger. The American soldier shot the British sniper, saving Lafayette's life. The American soldier was court-martialed for disobeying the order. They didn't want this group to shoot. Of course, he was acquitted once they found out what happened. Lafayette didn't meet him, but he knew about him. He knew his name. His name was Amos Parker. He was supposed to be the tallest American soldier during the Revolutionary War. I could never find out the height.
Is he from Camden or up that
Oh,
way?
Augusta.
Augusta.
He's buried in Augusta. In fact, it's on his tombstone. I believe that he's the tallest. Mm-hmm. Yes. Anyway, and as you know, in 1825, Lafayette visited Utica. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a celebration next year to commemorate Lafayette's visit back to Utica. And what year was it that he came in?
1825.
All right.
So it'll be 200 years.
200 years. So they're going to be, I know the DAR is involved. There's a bunch of people involved. Leslie Rainey, who's going to be a guest on this show this fall to talk about some of the things they're going to do, and including a reenactment of Lafayette coming through.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's going to be a reenactment of that. But what he did was he came back over, Frank, and where did he start this tour?
Well, he by the way, he'd been invited by Congress to return to have his grand tour. He was up in age by that time. So he came in 1824. He visited a lot of places. But by 1825, he wanted to make sure he visited Oneida County. So he was in Rome, Oriskany, Whitesboro, and then on the Rome Road, Rome Street, actually they called it, he come into Utica. And one of the reasons he wanted to come to Utica, during the Revolutionary War, one of his friends was John Adams, who would become second president of the United States. John Adams' granddaughter lived in Utica. on a building that was on the site of where the bank with the gold dome is now. Abigail Adams Johnson, her husband was Alexander Johnson, and he came. He did. Well, we've talked about when he came into Utica.
Part of it was he came in partly on canal boat, and then he transferred onto a coach driven by a pretty famous guy.
Right, a coach driven by Theodore Faxton, who was a young man, was a stagecoach driver. 6 big horses, silver-plated harness, very fancy. Plus, it was quite a. There was a military escort, and behind them there were dozens and dozens of men and women on horses. So it was a pretty big caravan coming into Utica.
And they came in on what is now Lafayette Street, right?
Later they changed they changed Rome Street to Lafayette. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is still. I know I asked Leslie Rainey about this because I haven't been down to Hotel Utica for a while. And I was curious, is that plaque still up there?
It's still
she
there,
said it's
yeah.
still there.
Yeah, it's still there. It's pretty bad shape.
Yeah.
Needs to be cleaned up a little bit.
And I think she said her group was going to do that. We'll ask her about it when she comes on here. But basically the plaque says that it was on this street. And
Yeah, that, the fact that he didn't stay overnight in Utica. But 2 things, he did visit John Adams' granddaughter, who at that time also was the niece of the current president, John Quincy Adams. He stayed at the Baggs Hotel, and while he was there, I had mentioned this Amos Parker who had saved his life. Parker knew he was going to be there and was dying to see him. So he went to the hotel room, and of course, they said that, Lafayette's resting, but he said, well, I'm the one who saved his life. And, well, Lafayette had never met him, but he knew about the incident.
Yeah.
So he'd come in and they hugged him.
we got to find out how tall he was. Somewhere I've read it, but I can't remember. Yeah, we got to find out how tall he was. Frank, thanks for coming in.
No problem.
As always. Well, that's going to do it for us this week. We'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Don't forget cnyhomepage.com. There's a lot of good stuff there. Until next time, take care of yourself, everybody.